Alito, Chima Chukma, Saho Chefa at Joniel Henderson, Choctaw Sia Hoke. Now, I just said hello to you in the Choctaw language and hoped everyone was doing well. I also offered a thank you to elders in that. And yet, I'm speaking to people here that themselves actually know some Choctaw. Everyone in this room knows at least 3 Choctaw words. You'll know one of the primary colors. You will know how to say all of humankind. And you will know how to say things are going well. And so, to backtrack on that, the primary color is Hama. The word for all of people is Okla. Let me ask you to sort of put those together, Oklahoma. It is a compound Choctaw word that actually means people red. You also, however, know how to say things are doing well. And I would bet that everyone in here, even today, has said this word sometime. And I'm going to tell you about a photograph I saw of a approximately 170-year-old letter from Andrew Jackson, who swept the southeastern Indians out of their homes over to Indian Territory. And while in the Choctaw Nation area, which is the Mississippi River Valley area originally, he picked up a word, and in a memo back to Washington, D.C., said things are H-O-K-E, and in Choctaw it's pronounced Hoke. Linguists will have debates about whether it actually came from that or not, but there is that connection. And today we say, how are you doing? And the response would be Hoke. There's a H, an aspiration there at the beginning of it. I want to also, before going on, to put on one of these get-togethers like this. It takes a huge amount of effort and a large number of people. And so I really do thank Dr. Asthana for his work here and for inviting me here. Dr. Carrie Gleason, who has been so generous with the research work that she's done through the ADC here with Oneida Nation. And I came up to University of Minnesota about 3 years ago from Oklahoma. And Oklahoma right now has 39 federally recognized tribes. Minnesota has 11, but I didn't know anybody there. And so one of my starting points was to get to know tribal communities, and that is a thing that just takes some time. And Carrie Gleason and I had become aware of each other now being neighbors. And so she very generously introduced me and members of my team to the work that she is doing with the Oneida Nation and the people of the Oneida Nation who have been so responsive. And so I really do appreciate that greatly. And last, like I said, there's many people, but Eva Davenport has been taxiing me around. But before that, we developed a kind of email deep relationship. So here I am, and I'm glad to be here, and I want to learn how to make this go. There we go, okay. So by way of preview, I want to discuss tonight dementia and diabetes, but mainly from a prevention angle. Research today is showing very clearly that signs of the pathology of dementia shows up earlier in life and pre-symptomatically. And in some ways, diabetes can sneak up on people too, and they develop metabolic syndrome or the insulin resistance, which can then convert to actual type 2 diabetes. So early prevention is going to be a key here. Also, because we typically think about the effects of diabetes in terms of organ damage with regard to amputations, with regard to kidneys, with regard to vision loss, it sort of directs us away from thinking about the conditions that are causing those organs to fail. Much of that is happening via the capillaries in the brain as well. And so there is a real connection there. And I would want to end with some things to do. It's one thing, I think all of us researchers are really good at dissecting things into little tiny pieces. And then when it gets to what do we do about that, it's a little more difficult. So I think we, however, have some things that can help us out. But first, please pay attention to this slide, if you would, and that just is to say that just because someone has type 2 diabetes does not mean that they will get dementia. Okay? It's a risk factor. More importantly, if it is managed well, then that can be neuroprotective all by itself. But managing it well does have to take place. We think that a lot of diabetes effects might be found in vascular lesions in the brain, still producing confusion and ultimately memory loss. But good management of it might mean that when people ask a question, so what starts this thing? What can we do about it? It may well be that we are, even right now, staring right in the face a means of prevention. If much of diabetes was either prevented or reduced, the idea is that a lot of downstream dementia and some significant proportion of the amount of dementia might not ever happen or might be stopped. So I'm asking us tonight to think about not just diabetes as an induced condition that is mainly a lifestyle effect that we in a way can kind of do to ourselves or we can kind of prevent, but think about some proportion of dementia related to diabetes as an induced condition too. We're saying, how does this happen? We may be doing it to ourselves to some degree. Well, here's how this works. And this is the results from many decades of longitudinal studies on what causes health and what's associated with it. Very broadly, the more money a person has, the more health that they have. The less money they have, the less health that they have. Then, with less health, you get more toxic stress. And keeping in mind, we're all stressed. If we're conscious, we're stressed. But toxic stress is a different kind of stress, and that is associated with less health. With less health, we self-treat with comfort food. High carbs, high starches, for example. It's called comfort food for a reason, and that produces less health. A lot of that comfort food ends up being high sugar foods, junk foods, and that's associated now specifically with type 2 diabetes. And we're saying the more diabetes, more dementia. So notice what's happened here. We've gone from a non-biological thing, a dollar bill, to a highly biological pair of conditions. It would be mediated largely through this toxic stress piece, probably. So, we're going to start talking about Alzheimer's disease and dementia and diabetes in the grocery store. Right down the street from us here, I bet you there's a grocery store that is just as filled as that one, and there's probably 30 or 40 of them across Madison. But we live, just happens to be, that we live in one of the places on the earth with a hypercaloric environment. That means we are just surrounded by constant amounts of food. And some of that food is high sugar food, and some of it is alcohol food. And if we know that we should avoid these things, why don't we? One thing is that identifying where these sugars are in that grocery store is made difficult on purpose. These are marshmallows. If you see down in the bottom left-hand corner, right in here, naturally fat-free, and it's gluten-free. For a consumer, it's almost like a health food. And apparently, it's not illegal to market that way. And in fact, it's called neuromarketing. I didn't make this up. This is an actual specialty within marketing. And the point of it is that the blue part, this blue cerebral cortex portion up here, some rational thinking takes place there, but we're going to skip that and go right into the limbic system here, our emotional kind of centers, the emotional triggers. And there is a particular way of doing that. So I take this from a guy named Hank Cardello, who was an executive with the National Grocery Association. And in it, he reveals some of the industry secrets, and one of them is that we might feel like the grocery store down the street is there to feed us and keep us well and healthy and happy. What he says is that it's down there to just sell products, and if you will buy it, we will sell it. And so one of the things that is done is at the entrance to grocery stores, the junk food, the pastries, anyway, pastries and breads and pies and things like that are put right up there. They found most people hit the grocery store and they're hungry. That's the first thing you encounter. And then you try to leave, and you're further bombarded by all of these easily picked up items that are high sugar things. But one of the things that caught my attention the most is number 2, the kids' pester shelf. It has to do with the shelf layout strategy. And so people did anthropometric measurements of children from age 5 to 10. And they did not want to know just how high the top of their head was. They were measured for their eye level. And they placed the product at that level. And this is what that layout looks like. Those are for the adults. And right there, you get that. The bottom shelf is stuff few people would be picking up. So does that really happen? So I don't know if you can read from the back, but that's Fruit Loops and Kicks. And notice there are all these bright colors, cartoon images, glittery-looking, sugary content. And so the kid picks it up. They can reach it. They can see it. But then they pester mom until she finally gives in. And they take it home and down it. But let me ask you to think about this. Think about the fact that these neuromarketers, what if we think about it as they're exploiting a child's immature brain? And apparently that's just okay. With diabetes, there's a big S on purpose and underlined, because like with most things, it's not just one thing. And there's a number of items in print up here. Let me just run through these. The presence and amount of diabetes increases with age. You'll see this over half 55, and then as the age goes up, it continues to increase. That makes those people more likely to die earlier than someone without type 2 diabetes. Due to nerve problems in the extremities, and in this case particularly in the feet, is a higher risk for falls, which could result in surgeries, which could result in a mortality. Contributes to incontinence, and is a predictor for institutional long-term care. So it is something that is to be avoided. And yet, in the American Indian population, there is almost 3 times as much type 2 diabetes as in the majority population. So Indian country hasn't been sitting still doing nothing about it. You see here nearly 1 out of 6 American Indian and Alaska Natives has diabetes. And over on the right side, reversing diabetes, youth obesity and diabetes rates have not increased, which is another way of saying they haven't gone down, but they haven't increased. And yet buried up in this block here shows an increase from 2006 to 2013 in adult type 2 diabetes, recalling now that the frequency of it increases as we age. So there still is work to do. The amount is not evenly distributed across all populations, the amount of diabetes. American Indian, Alaska Natives are this bottom line, that big long line. The top one is the non-Hispanic white group. But so you see, this is affecting different populations in different ways. The yellow part of this pie chart is American Indian, Alaska Natives. Now, this isn't the amount of diabetes that's out there, it's death from it. The opposing purplish color up there are Pacific Islanders. So what we're doing, if you think about this, these are in reference to indigenous people, even geographically separated. So the diabetes business is an important thing in general, as well as with regard to brain health. Causes, plural, again, of dementia. And this is hugely complex, so I don't think that I can reel out all of the causes. But one of the things that has occurred that makes both of these conditions particularly important in today's world is that so it is literally true that there has never been a time in which so many people have lived for so long. And this is not ancient history, it's not something in the distant future. This is happening right this second, right this minute. As I'm getting older, every minute I'm part of this. So some of these matters that we're dealing with really are first-time issues to address. This is the Alzheimer's disease-related disorders, ADRD, increase from 2010 to 2060. And I think everyone here probably is very familiar with this projected dramatic increase in the amount of ADRD. And this is the demographics of the increase in aging in American Indian populations. So what we're seeing here in this population as well is people living longer and longer and longer. And another way of saying that is people are living more frequently into the ages of greatest risk for showing symptoms of some kind of dementia. And American Indian people, not so long ago, died 17 years before a corresponding white person. That has been shortened to 3 years now. Premature mortality in that population. And in some portions of North America, that is still really bad at around age 55 of premature death. So it's more work still to go there. Now this, I think, is an important slide because it is one of these answers to the question of what causes Alzheimer's disease, which of course we all want to know. And it is not absolutely known still at this point. But one of the things you see up here in the center of it is the image of a brain and beta amyloid and phosphorylated tau. But aging and genetics are remain the two absolutely known contributors to dementia. But we are, I think, in this room and elsewhere, experiencing a paradigm shift in the science of trying to understand Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And that shift is away from exclusively looking at beta amyloid and tau. Those, by the way, remain crucially important. We don't mean that we've left those, but we're adding to that a large array of other factors that can potentially be contributing to this person's development of dementia, ranging from, and by the way, here's gut microbiome, which anticipates Dr. Bendland's talk. Here we have diet and exercise. That's certainly related to metabolic health, avoidance of diabetes. And here's vascular risk factors up here. A number of possible inputs. I might even say probable inputs. It's just that we don't yet have the science to know what is the proportion of that contribution. But just be advised, because it doesn't say the word diabetes, that it's not buried in here in this diet and exercise portion. Let me have you look at this top part, the green, cognitive impairment. Stroke contributes to it, vascular dementia contributes to it, Alzheimer's disease contributes to it. Age, diabetes, diabetes. Those are the only two that cut across all of those boxes. So how do these things, and their different locations in the body, how do they actually get together? Let's start here. The brain runs mainly on glucose, and quite a bit of it, but it has to have the right amount. So we can overload it by ingesting sugars and carbs that become sugars. We can overload it, and then we get into an imbalance called hyperglycemia, too much glucose, too much blood sugar in its concentration. And it has causes multiple problems, but it does include dysfunctions and possible long-term damage. So here's the big web, and I'm just going to focus on a portion of it. On this left side, here in the middle, these green bubbles, says cognitive impairment, vascular dementia, Alzheimer's disease. Notice that all of those boxes have arrows all pointing there, all of them. So over on the right side, okay, I'm looking at it this way now. On the left side, this grouping over here, lifestyle factors, but includes mood disorders. There's the aging and genes. On this far right side is hypertension and stroke from that. And here is insulin dysregulation and abnormal ability to use it, leaving a high concentration of glucose in the blood, which of course still goes to the brain. At the bottom right here in the purpley pink box is hypoglycemia, too little blood sugar. And so if you don't have enough blood sugar, the brain just can't work normally, but that's fairly fixable by taking in some more energy. But at the top, just a couple of things. Here's hyperglycemia, the blood sugar is too high. And we're going to focus just on this one portion here that reads endothelial dysfunction. And that refers to the cells that line the interior and exterior of a capillary in the brain. Capillary being one of these microscopic size blood vessels that is about the width of one red cell, so very tiny. And in spite of all of that, there is a complex architecture of multiple anatomy all up and down these capillaries that are important for the correct amount of glucose getting into the brain. So I think I have two of these. So this is one. This is a brain capillary, and what I want to point out in the middle here, it's like you've cut it like you would cut a garden hose, and now we're looking down the inside of it. That would be the blood flow that's in it, the blood cells. And this yellow representation is a cell called an endothelium, but there's thousands of them winding all throughout. There are other cells like this green one called a pericyte. It's also helping to tend the integrity of that blood vessel. This is, as you see up here, where the blood-brain barrier mainly occurs. Well, what happens is that the glucose that's in this blood has to be transported out of it through the walls of this blood vessel, of this capillary, to get into the extracellular part of brain tissue so it can be used to let the brain operate. There are really fantastic chemistries that occur that transport that glucose out of the bloodstream and through the walls out here where it can be used. And so here's a brain cell over here to the far right. Now, and there are waste products that have to go back into it the other way and transport it out, clear out of the brain. So imagine that we have this high concentration of glucose in our blood, head to toe. But right now we're in the brain. And the ability of these endothelial cells to operate correctly and for the signaling systems to transport glucose out into its use in the brain. If that is damaged, then the brain is not able to get a sufficient amount of nutrients, of glucose, of oxygen even. And so this is the place where the diabetes dementia connection can occur. If this goes on without sufficient regulation of glucose, that is, the person is not managing this well, that's where the risk comes in for permanent damage to this neuron and possibly even death of that neuron, which will not replicate. So that's the location, but here's why. Forget about the diagram at the top. The bottom words summarize the effects on the brain. Right here on the left side, reduced cerebral blood flow. So it can't get even enough nutrients in O2 and glucose there, and it produces hypoxia because insufficient oxygen amounts. Blood-brain barrier dysfunction means that the balance that is physiologically tried to be achieved on the amount of glucose going in and out is not what it needs to be. The dynamics of all of this anatomy up here means the cells may die. And the reduced clearance allows for protein accumulation, all because of exposure to hyperglycemic conditions inside these blood vessels. So let's apply this now to American Indian people. Not a whole lot is known, by the way, but one of the earliest studies by a neurologist named Hugh Hendry looked at Manitoba, Canada, here's Winnipeg, and he compared a group of native people, native Cree people, to people in Winnipeg, Canada. And what he found was this, that the title, by the way, was one of the best titles I've ever seen in a science journal, and it was just simply Alzheimer's Rare in Cree. If they were all that straightforward and simple, we'd be very happy. So here's the numbers. Notice the big difference in the native Cree population, 0.5 versus 3.5. And now this is in the early 90s, so there was still a lot to learn. This was not, we would certainly not think of it as having an absolute diagnosis, but some indicators of it. Then when he changed it from Alzheimer's disease to dementia terms, more broadly cognitive impairment, then it happened in this case to equal what was in Winnipeg. But the Alzheimer's type he considered to be rare. Staying in Canada, but shifting from the early 1990s to the mid-2000s, is work done by my associate director, Dr. Kristen Jacklin, and her team, that shows in southern Ontario the following. If you look over here on the left, you can see the prevalence is around 34% in First Nations people in southern Canada. There's earlier signs of onset. There are more men than women, and the rate of developing the condition is faster, and if we knew why all of these things were happening, we would be very happy. But these currently constitute research questions for us about Native people. Now, shifting to more work in the early 90s by a guy named Roger Rosenberg. And he's working with Oklahoma Cherokee, which is this top reddish color, northeastern part of Oklahoma. And his findings were the following. Those are the criteria, the diagnostic or screening criteria that were used. And so what he found was the following here. That is that when we, if we're going to do genetic work or molecular work or medical work with American Indian people, and I think actually most people, but certainly here, we need to understand a little bit about genetic admixture so that some people have a very high genetic load of North American indigenous genes, whereas other people are tribal members, but they have a lower amount of indigenous genes. And so for these kinds of studies, that can make a difference. And what he's saying in this last bullet is the following. If a person has a high degree of indigenous genes, then the development of Alzheimer's type dementia is lower. So it suggests there may be some protection of some kind in population genetics for Alzheimer's among these. When ApoE4 was put into it, it didn't make any difference with regard to developing Alzheimer's or not. Next, in Oklahoma, in the bottom corner here in the brown is the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And nearly I forgot to put this in here. So, in hospitals, phlebotomists that go around drawing blood are often called vampires or bats. So that is the word for Choctaw bat, which is one of our good friends, CHR, is doing a blood draw there. And what I found was this with regard to the frequency of E4. The tall right column is the frequency for the white population. This short one over here is the frequency of E4 allele in people that have the highest genetic load of indigenous genes and were over 55 years of age. So independently, Roger Rosenberg and I found a similar kind of effect with regard to E4. And what happens as the frequency goes up here is more and more European or Caucasian genes were added into those individuals, and the presence of E4 went up. So we found an inverse relationship also, and we found that if E4 was present, it didn't matter. And so the resilience to that is an interesting question that people are exploring also. But one of the important things here is that Cherokee people are Iroquoian speakers, and they are at contact time, we're in the eastern Carolinas, and that's where the federal reservation is today. Choctaw speakers are Muskogean speakers, and all those southeastern Seminoles, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks are all Muskogean speakers. So what it means is the people we call the Cherokee were formerly Iroquoian people, migrated for some reason, some portion migrated for some reason into the Carolinas. Now we're swept out and we find them in Indian Territory. So the point here is that Rosenberg and I had similar kinds of findings from tribes that came from two very different geographic areas. It just makes us wonder to what degree is that a representative profile? Does that apply to other tribes or all native people? We certainly don't know right now. But the finding is this: the more that there is an American Indian genetic load, the less presence of E4 might suggest that there is some kind of protective benefit operating somehow. So if there's not much of this going on, is that reflected linguistically? And so I would ask older people for what would you call this, or what did you call this? Was there a name for this confusional state we call dementia? And they would run through these kind of candidates almost universally. So Tasimbo, Okpalat Chaha, which is crazy, and then Lupia Chukmakeyu, This loopy is brain, the Chukma is good, KU is not. But then they would kind of settle on this one, and it is Imanic Phila Kania, which means the intellect is no longer there, but it doesn't mean it's gone. It means it's displaced. The intellect is still present, but we can't access that at this point. So there is cultural features with American Indian people. We've talked about some of the biology now, but cultural features of this includes the following here, and that is Pokney is the Choctaw word for grandmother. So this woman, Mrs. Maytubby, is an older Choctaw woman, is what that says under there. Maytubby is a Choctaw name that comes from the native language and then is drastically altered into English, but it's not Tubby, it's actually Ubby, which means killer. So watch out. Well, the granddaughter told me as we were there visiting with her Pokney there that she sees things we don't. And think how different that is if someone had said, she sees things that aren't there. She's hallucinating, she's got a brain disease, this is really strange, and just let her chatter on. That's not how it was interpreted. It was interpreted as Mrs. Maytubby literally looking into the other side before she died and describing to people, the lucid people around in the room, the names of people that had walked on before, favorite horses, favorite dogs, talked about vegetable garden. And this wasn't just one time, that she would do this with some frequency. And so, in a social cultural way, it became a little bit of a special honor to have this happening in our presence. We're seeing that there really is another side, that there are recognizable people, even recognizable animals, and that she was talking with them in preparation for going there. In southwestern Oklahoma, with end-of-life matters and southwestern tribes, Plains Indians people, they talk about knowing the person was going to imminently go to the other side when they began to speak a little more lucidly, and they would talk about seeing their relatives coming to get them. And that's when the family, then, the lucid family, would start singing prayer songs. My Pokney, Choctaw, died in a nursing home bed with my mother and her sister, who got into the bed with her and, as they said, sang her over to the other side. So one kind of brain disease caused by many possibly different things and interpreted and responded to in very different ways. Researchers, like all of us, and participants benefit from understanding and being able to better communicate with people in different population segments by being open to these varieties of interpretation that go along with heartfelt feelings. So I want to thank you all for your time, and I appreciate the work that you do as caregivers and the professionals here and the ADC. You all right here in this room in Madison really are among academic research stars, honest to goodness, and just because they're local doesn't mean they're not stars. They're national and international stars, and I appreciate getting to be here. Okay.